Here with you all. This is very exciting because rarely, as I was telling somebody, do I get to do this where the history actually happened. And so, especially this morning, the things we're going to do are not going to be in chronological order, kind of just because of you do certain things for Bible study and Sunday school, and service and all that. But this evening is when we're going to get to the Pilgrims. Okay, Pilgrims in Jamestown. We're going to see the major comparing and contrasting between those two colonies, one that followed God and one that did not follow God. And you'll see the difference in the results when we explore that this evening. For our Bible study, I'm going to set us up for our Sunday morning main service in going to the time following Plymouth. Plymouth and the Massachusetts Bay Colony will eventually unite and become one big colony. And then after that, you start having, is it working? See, this is good. We get to trial run. Now, did I do that or did you? I did that. You did that? Okay, so, did I do? All right, very good. Okay. So, here are the colonies. How many of them are there? 13, very good. All right. See, I used to be a school teacher, so I like to hear the answer. Very good. Virginia, 1624. Maryland, 1632. Rhode Island, Connecticut in 36. Carolina in 63. It'll eventually be split into North and South, 1712. And then New York, New Jersey, Delaware in 64. Pennsylvania, in 1681. And Georgia, finally, in 1732. The population will go, when we just had Virginia and Massachusetts, those original two colonies there, we had about 1,980 people here in 1625. By 1775, 150 years later, we've jumped to 2.4 million people living here in the colonies because it was an incredible place to come. Freedom and liberty and prosperity and opportunity. It was abundantly available here if you were willing to come and work hard and put forth that effort, and if you survived. There's disease, there's all kinds of stuff, all kinds of trials. It's very scary to come over originally, but of course as the years went on, it became more and more opportunistic. London is 3,000 miles away, 2 months by boat, and so the majority of things here in the colonies were ran by the people, locally elected. Parliament didn't have much involvement, and things prospered. And the empire benefited because the more prosperous the people were here, the more prosperous the empire was. A little lesson from history. The less involved the government is in the people's lives, guess how the people do? Exactly. And so, things, though, began to change in the 1750s. Because we have 75,000 French traders and soldiers begin traveling the rivers of the western frontier. And they established commerce and very good relations with the Native Americans, married many of the natives, especially the daughters of the chiefs, creating strong bonds between the two cultures of the natives and the French. 1.5 million British colonists lived more along the coastal region, and so you had this buffering frontier between the main river systems there, the Ohio and the Mississippi, and the coastline of the English. And the French decide through this to take advantage of all this. In the spring of 1753, Paul Marin de la Mergue, it's French, takes 2,000 men and builds forts all along the St. Lawrence, the Allegheny, the Ohio, and the Mississippi rivers. Now, this stirs up a lot of apprehension and a little anxiety over along the coast because this is their territory. You see how it looks here, okay, and who claimed it? But back on this previous one, look at how they drew the map. This is an English map. Where's their western boundary? Off the map. Okay? That's what their charter from the king says, is they have however long, however far, until you colonize all that. That's yours. That's for future expansion and growth and exploration and discovery. And now you got the French coming in here and taking over all this. Okay? And so there were many who had invested in companies for westward expansion, the establishment of not just real estate ownership, but trading, all the fur trade and all that kind of stuff. And now the French have come in and taken it. So those who are invested in that, such as those in the Ohio Company, like the governor of Virginia, Governor Robert Dinwiddie. Now that's not nice to smirk at somebody's name like that. Governor Dinwiddie, and a couple of other men, such as Augustine and Lawrence Washington, the two older half-brothers of George. They are invested in the Ohio Company, and this is not good for their future potential in that company. Now, Lawrence will die of tuberculosis before what we read about takes place, but he had eventually been invested in that. So, these new French forts, they're causing a problem. In October of 1753, Governor Dinwiddie dispatches 21-year-old Major George Washington of the Virginia Regiment to go meet with and warn the French that they need to leave Virginia territory. This has been staked out as Virginia territory for much longer than you've been here, and so you need to leave. Now, Washington's a great choice for this because what was his occupation? He's a surveyor. He is very good at mapping out the land and knowing the back roads and the woodlands and scouting and all that kind of stuff. And so he's a great choice to go and do this. Washington and the regiment arrive at Fort Le Boeuf in December on the 12th. And General Saint-Pierre invites Washington in, fixes a very nice dinner. It's very cordial. They have a good time discussing things and everything. Finally, after dinner, Major Washington presents the diplomatic request for peaceful withdrawal of the French presence there in Virginia territory, to which the French general says, no. And so Washington says, thank you for dinner, and he goes home. And returns to the capital in Williamsburg to report to Governor Dinwiddie that they're not going to leave. So on May 1st, 1754, Washington is sent with Virginia forces to capture Fort Duquesne at the fork of the Allegheny and Monongahela River. I always have to explain that to everybody else, but you all know where that's at. As that will eventually become known as Fort Pitt, and now, of course, modern day Pittsburgh. So, and by the way, so I have the colloquial correctly. Is it Allegheny and Monongahela, or do you all pronounce it a different way around here? Okay, now what? Monongahela. Okay, see, I wanted to make sure I get that right. Okay, Monongahela. Very good. May 24th, about 60 miles away, Indian scouts alert Washington of nearby French troops. So he immediately begins a hurried construction of a fort out of necessity. Hence, it is known as Fort Necessity. It is a glorified wooden fence. Who's been there? Okay, Wednesday is our field trip. Okay, we're taking a field trip Wednesday, going down to see it, and a few other spots, okay. Has the storehouse there in the middle. It's completed June 3rd. A few days later, 100 British regulars for support show up, and Washington invites them in. They're like, yeah, no, we'll stay over here outside. That's okay. Thank you for the invite. So he has about 400 guys. However, about a third of them get sick. So he really only has about 300 fighting men available to go up against the French. Colonel Joshua Fry, who had brought the British, he died actually in a skirmish on the way. And so this leaves Washington to be in charge of the whole thing, which gets him a field promotion to colonel. And that's how he becomes Colonel George Washington. Now, the French, being led by General Louis Coulon de Villiers, attacks on July 3rd with 600 French regulars and Canadian militia and around 100 Native Americans. So you have about 700 versus 300. Not very good odds for Washington and his men. The attack begins at around 11 a.m., continues till 8 o'clock p.m. 9 hours of this. Heavy rain had flooded the trenches that are built up there. When we go there, you'll see a little bit of earthworks that are still around the fort. Those are original, done by George Washington and his men. And now it's filled in some over the years, obviously, so it was deeper than what it is now, but it flooded a great deal. When you see the diorama that they have in the museum, you'll see they've got it showing that it's flooded and it's muddy. Very bad circumstances for them. Many of them will have to go inside the fort and just try to get their guns way up over the fence and try to shoot at them, whereas the Native Americans are climbing up into the trees and shooting down into the fort. This is a horrible circumstance for Washington and his men. When we go there, also you will notice he's like, well, the trees are a lot farther away. Well, the open area has been, is not what it used to be. The trees used to be a little closer to the fort than what you see today. But finally, the French general sends a soldier under a white flag to call for a truce because they know this is not going to go well. So they offer surrender. Washington negotiates. Says, well, maybe I'll surrender if, and then he lays out these conditions for his men to be able to go home, especially with their weapons, with their guns. Because these are regular Virginia men who have families back home, whom they need to feed, which they have to use what to feed them? Their guns, okay? And so the French say, okay, yeah, you can take them home. And so the regiment is allowed to leave the next morning, July 4th, 1754, and return to Virginia. Washington had lost 31 men. Surprisingly, that's all that died. And it is believed that in the raised earthen works that you'll see there, some of their bodies are buried there. So if you're going on the field trip, they always ask you to kind of be a little solemn and quiet around that because they consider it an actual graveyard. The French had only lost 3 out of all that. When they returned, the Virginia House of Burgesses votes an official public thank you to Washington's brave men for their stance against the French. The French, however, now control the entire Ohio Valley, and they begin plundering any and all English traders who venture into the region, and there is no resistance. So once news of all this gets across the pond, back to Europe, England and France send things into an absolute downward spiral. The English are going to send an expeditionary force to dislodge the French hold in what was now being called New France. Oh, they didn't like that. And the French find out, and so they send 6 regiments for reinforcements. The British find out they're going to do that, so they send their fleet to block the French port so they don't leave. The French find out they're going to do that, so they just leave early. And so one thing leads to another, and the British they're upset because they missed them, so they just begin harassing any and every French ship they could find out on the open waters, and Britain officially finally declares war on France on May 17, 1756. Their ally of Prussia, mostly a German state, joins them. France's ally of Austria and Russia joins them, and so what ensues becomes the 7 Years' War. Look at where it took place. This is the first ever you could consider in history to be a global world war. All because George Washington went and had dinner with a French guy. Britain's strategy is to attack everywhere, use their powerful, mighty navy, and just see where all they can make great advances and conquests over the French. The French, though, they're a little apprehensive because if you know anything about French history, they've been conquered or ruled a time or two by Britain, and the last thing they want to do is have the British monarchy ruling over them. So they just want to defend the homeland. That's pretty much their primary. Back in America, April of 1755, recently arrived General Edward Braddock invites Colonel George Washington to come out of retirement. He was enjoying the farming life now on his new property that he had inherited after his half-brother Lawrence and his wife died, and they had no children. And so he inherited his estate, which had been named by his older brother Mount Vernon. And so he is loving living there, and the last thing he wants to do is leave. But out of a sense of duty, Washington accepts the general's invitation. News that did not go over very well with his mother. Mary rushes to Mount Vernon and says, "How can you do this to your poor mother? Please don't go. I can't stand the thought of you being in harm's way." And Washington says to her, and this is the quote we have from him, "The God to whom you commended me, madam, when I set out upon a more perilous errand," he believed the last one was going to be way more dangerous than this new one because he's going to have a big French army or a British army with him this time. "That God defended me from all harm, and I trust he will do so now. Do not you?" "Okay, fine, you can go." And so he does, and Braddock's forces, including 2 Irish regiments he had brought, plus the local militia, set out from Fort Cumberland, Maryland on May 29th, numbering 2,100 strong. The entire expedition with the wagons and the cannon, the supplies, the men, stretches 4 miles long. The progress is very slow. They frequently had to widen the road for the artillery and the wagons and everything like that. But Washington was like, they made a mountain out of every little mound we came to. And we had to make it, level it up. "No, that's not wide enough." And Washington said, "Just go." Anyway, it was frustrating. So frustrating, even more so for Washington, because he gets sick. Severe headaches, migraines, and fevers. And Braddock is just appalled at how long this is taking. He's used to the big open fields of Europe. And so he divides them up. He's going to take 1,300 of them, called the flying column, and they're just going to march through, and everybody else is going to come up behind them with all the supplies and reinforcements, that kind of stuff. Washington insists that he goes with Braddock because he knows the territory. He's already been through there once. And they're like, "Are you sure?" And he's like, "Yes, I've got to go with you." So he rides in the hospital wagon, feeling every bump of the road, and that wooden wagon had to be absolutely miserable. And so they start out on June 19th with their new group. Along the way, they meet some Shawnee and Delaware Indians who offer their help. They're not happy about what's happened with the French. Washington's like, "Great, this is fantastic. I'll just sleep and you just listen to them." Braddock's like, "What do we need them for?" And Washington's like, they know the area, and they can scout out, and they can tell us what's happening. And it's a huge help. Braddock's like, "Well, okay, fine, whatever. We don't really need them." He gives them the cold shoulder. Eventually, they leave. Washington's like, "Come here. This is not open field warfare of Europe. These guys are going to be coming at you from behind trees. You won't see them. You'll have no idea somebody's up there till you're already past them. You've got to have the natives' help." And Braddock supposedly said that the continental troops may be frightened by the natives, but they can make no impression on the king's regulars. July 7th, they come to within 12 miles of Fort Duquesne. July 8th, they meet more friendly Indians who are willing to help, offer their assistance again. Braddock has the same response. Fine, they leave. And after Washington again implores him to help, so finally July 9th, we're in 1755, they're marching along the Monongahela River. Did I get that right? Okay. Make a note here. Monongahela. Okay. So I know for where I go other places. It's good. They come within 10 miles of the fort. Washington describes the scene. This is what he wrote. Quote, "Every man was neatly dressed in full uniform. The soldiers were arranged in columns and marched in exact order. The sun gleamed from their burnished arms. The river flowed tranquilly on their right, and the deep forest overshadowed them with solemn grandeur on the left. Officers and men were equally inspirited with cheering hopes and confident anticipations." And they had reason to be, because they thought the fort was lightly defended. And it had been, until they'd received some Canadian reinforcements that brought their numbers up to 1,600, which if they had listened to some Indian scouts, they might have known. They send out, the French do, 108 French regulars, 146 Canadian militiamen, 637 natives for a combined force of 891 up against Braddock's 1,300 that he has, okay? The French, though, are late in getting out there for their ambush, and so Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage, who you'll hear his name mentioned in the second service here, he had gone forward with 350 men just to kind of go out and get a little perimeter check and everything. They accidentally run into each other because they were coming out to set up their ambush, and they're like, oh, man, and so they start shooting at each other about 7 miles from the fort at 1 o'clock p.m. Gage immediately opens fire. The French open fire. The 100 Canadians turn around and run back to the fort. I don't know why. Why the Canadians did. But anyway, the French and the natives take up their positions. Braddock hears what's going on. He's about a few miles away. And so he gets the other 950 to start moving forward. The rest of the reinforcements, all the baggage and the wagons and the cattle and all that stuff, they're still 40 miles away. Gage is taking on a lot of fire, so he turns around and starts heading back to Braddock. So you got Braddock running this way, Gage running this way. Guess what happens? It's a major crash. And absolute chaos and pandemonium breaks out. Confusion everywhere. Besides that, you have the deadly musket fire coming from every direction imaginable. And so you don't know what is going on. Plus, you could be shooting. Your comrade is right there. You take it to here, you turn around. His scalp is now pinned right on the tree beside you. That was happening that fast. And the deafening whooping cry, the war cry of the native, absolutely had to be the most terrifying experience these guys ever would go through in their entire lives. The musket fire is coming from everywhere. And Braddock is livid. He is absolutely outraged at this kind of warfare. How dare you fight like this? He rides up to his officers and men and would beat them, this is what they reported, would beat them with his sword and tell them, get in formation, get in line, and start fighting like British soldiers. And his officers are actually kind of inspired. He is undaunted. And so they start getting guys organized, and they start getting their little firing lines. They begin shooting everything, and they actually start to hold their ground for a while, even though they're very easy targets, as you can imagine. What's funny is the Virginian soldiers, they immediately jumped into the woods. They knew what was going on, which meant sometimes they were in the line of fire from the British, who were supposed to be their allies, because they don't know what's going on. But they actually kind of made some headway. They knew how to deal with this. So they hold their own for about 3 hours, actually, taking on the fire and all this. Washington, still recovering from his sickness, is riding back and forth, taking messages from Braddock to the officers all over the place, trying to keep things somewhat organized. Braddock himself will have 5 horses shot out from underneath of him. Until finally, after 3 hours, Braddock takes a shot to the chest. And so after he goes down, Washington assumes command, and he begins to organize a retreat to get the rear guard to assist them and get back to the other guys. And the retreat is successful in that they're not pursued. The French did not think they had the necessary forces to go after them, and the natives went about with the scalping and plundering, which they would normally do after a battle. And so wagons, guns, artillery, cattle, horses, baggage, provisions, 25,000 pounds of currency, and Braddock's personal papers are all left behind. One of the baggage wagons was being driven by a man named Daniel Boone. He and his cousin Daniel Morgan are attacked by natives starting to climb up on the wagon when he jumps down, cuts the reins, and they ride off on the horses from the wagon, like right out of a movie. Well, of the 1,300 British forces, 456 are killed, another 422 wounded. Out of 86 officers, 63 were wounded, 26 of them would die. Of the 50 women who had accompanied that group to provide for the cleaning and the cooking and all that, 4 made it back out of 50. Half were killed, half were taken prisoner. The French had only 27 killed compared to 456, and 57 wounded compared to 422. Braddock would die 3 days later on July 13th. Washington performed the funeral as Braddock was buried, and as you'll see on the field trip Wednesday, if you go, not very far from Fort Necessity, just down the road. After the burial, they run their wagons over the dirt to obscure the burial plot because they were afraid that it may be dug up and desecrated later on. And in 1804, his remains were discovered by a road crew that was coming through there. They exhumed the body and gave him this new grave site with the marble monument that was erected in 1911. And what's neat is actually you can go down from that around onto the original road, and they have the spot marked where they originally found his remains there. Washington gets the army back to Colonel Thomas Dunbar and the reserve forces 7 miles away. Dunbar assumes command and organizes the formal retreat. They destroyed all the remaining supplies and cannon, burning around 150 wagons. I guess they didn't know they were not being pursued, but they thought they had to in order to get back to safety. The 7 Years' War, which locally was known as the French and Indian War, would take a turn in 1962 when Russia will switch sides after the ascension of Tsar Peter III. That'll put Britain, Ireland, Prussia, Portugal, Hanover, and Russia against France, Austria, Saxony, Spain, and Sweden. That's an interesting lineup there, isn't it, on those two sides? Things will turn out quite well for Britain. They end up with the bulk of French territory in North America. They also are able to get Spanish Florida and some of the Caribbean islands. They also acquired many French trading posts in India. Why are they excited about that? Drink the tea. Yes, most of their tea was coming from China at that time. In fact, most of the tea thrown into the Boston Harbor during the Tea Party was Chinese tea. But they're excited about getting India for all of that. The French, as I said, they're losing everything. Spain gets Cuba, the Philippines, Louisiana, and land west of the Mississippi. And the French at least have their home. Everyone, though, everyone had a massive amount of war debt. France's will be the worst, leading to absolute chaos in their country, which we'll talk about Tuesday night, actually. And altogether, around the world, there were 1 million casualties from this war. Back in America, the colonies felt they had been dragged into this whole affair. As if it were not for Parliament and their ambitions or whatever, none of this would have happened. And everything would have been just fine. Britain, however, felt that they had done a great service for the colonies. And because of all the benefits they received due to Britain's protective arm, they needed to help fork up some of the expenses of this past war, specifically through some new taxes. And this is what leads Britain to meddle into the colonial affairs far more than they had ever done so before, when all the colonists wanted was just to be left alone, let things go back to the way they were before. They would not get that desired outcome, and a new king ascends to the throne halfway through the war, which is where we will pick up in this story coming up. So, this one major event here that we spent this session on, why is it such a big deal? A few days after it all happened, Washington took to writing his mother to assure her that he was fine, though quite weak and exhausted from 10 days of sickness and battle. He wrote the same day, July 18, 1755, and I've got a printout of it on that display table back there if you'd like to read it, to his brother John. I also have the one he wrote to his commanding officer. And this is what he wrote to John. As I have heard since my arrival at this place a circumstantial account of my death and dying speech, I take this early opportunity of contradicting the first and of assuring you that I have not, as yet, composed the latter. But by the all-powerful dispense of providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability and expectation, for I had 4 bullets through my coat and 2 horses shot under me. Yet, although death was leveling my companions on every side of me, escaped unhurt. Who did he thank? His Creator, his God. And George wasn't the only one to notice this. Mary Draper Ingalls was one of those ladies from Virginia who was captured during a council of French and Indians that she was able to overhear. She heard them talking about the battle, and having met Washington back in Virginia, she asked if they knew what had happened to him. And the Frenchmen told her of an Indian chief, Red Hawk, shooting 11 times at Washington. And because his gun had never missed before or since, the chief believed Washington was protected by the Great Spirit. On August 17th of that year, preacher Samuel Davies, who would later be president of Princeton, delivered a message to Captain Overton's Independent Company of Volunteers in Hanover County, Virginia. And the sermon was entitled, Religion and Patriotism, the Constituents of a Good Soldier. In it, Mr. Davies told of Washington's divine safety during the battle and concluded, quote, I may point out to the public that heroic youth, Colonel Washington, whom I cannot but hope Providence has hitherto preserved in so signal a manner for some important service to his country. In 1770, Washington and his friend Dr. James Craik are traveling to explore Western territories when they meet a Native American tribe on today's Ohio-West Virginia border. The chief spoke, and this is what Dr. Craik wrote down, this is what he recorded, was spoken to Washington. The chief said, I am chief and ruler over many tribes. My influence extends to the waters of the Great Lakes and to the far blue mountains. I have traveled a long and weary path that I might see the young warrior of the great battle. It was on the day when the white man's blood mixed with the streams of our forest that I first beheld the chief, talking about George Washington. I called to my young men and said, Mark yon tall and daring warrior. He is not of the redcoat tribe. He hath an Indian's wisdom, and his warriors fight as we do. Remember the Virginians jumped into the woods? Okay. Himself is alone, exposed. Quick, let your aim be certain, and he dies. Our rifles were leveled, rifles which, but for you, knew not how to miss. 'Twas all in vain. A power mightier far than we shielded you. Seeing you were under the special guardianship of the Great Spirit, we immediately ceased to fire at you. I am old and soon shall be gathered to the great council fire of my fathers in the land of shades. But ere I go, there is something bids me speak in voice of prophecy. Listen, the Great Spirit protects that man, pointing at Washington, and guides his destinies. He'll become the chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will hail him as the founder of a mighty empire. I am come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven and who can never die in battle. And the miracle of the protective shield around George Washington not only continued through that war, but through his entire life, especially in the Revolution. Washington never once received a wound in battle. And the crazy thing about it is he's the tallest guy usually on the field on a big white horse, the easiest target. And at times, like at the Battle of Princeton, I believe it was, he ran out in front of his men. It was between the two firing sides. So that's great. That's amazing. That's wonderful. What does this have to do with us today? Well, for one, it again, amongst the endless examples in American history, shows the divine involvement and intervention in the establishment of this country. It shows that this country was founded by godly leaders who relied upon the Lord and His Word to establish this new nation. Okay? Now, I'm not one of these guys who thinks, God needed the United States and therefore miraculously created. No, I don't think that. The people who came here, though, were faithful to him, and he blessed. You see the way that works. Secondly, it shows what can happen in the life of a faithful person. All Washington ever did was be mindful of the moment and be faithful in that moment. He was a man of deep faith and prayer. We're going to talk about his life more in depth tomorrow night and his faith and how deep man of faith he was. And we're going to talk about the slavery issue on Wednesday night, because that's something that we need to talk about, because, one, we need to be honest about our history and our past, otherwise we won't learn from it, okay? But secondly, we need to know the truth of the matter as well, because much of it has been twisted and maligned and may not be what you thought it was. Okay, so we're going to deal with that. Washington, though, was mindful and tried the best he could to be faithful in the moment. And that's what we need to do today. 1 Chronicles 12:32, the sons of Issachar were men who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. Esther, 4:14, she was put there for such a time. But most importantly, as we wrap this up, a great, heroic, or historic moment is not what defines a successful life. A successful life is simply a faithful life. One in which you are mindful of your walk with Christ and simply live each day for Him. It doesn't take some great dramatic moment or event. That's one of the kind of negative things about, sometimes these motivational speakers who come in, and talk about the great, extravagant, incredible, horrible, devastating things that happen, but they just got lucky, and well, that's not how this works. It takes faithfulness. Usually this is how it happens. It's time to give our testimony. And so we all sit around or whatever, and we have great historic things in the past that we've done, but when it's time for us to give our testimony, usually somebody has talked about how they were so far from the Lord, they walked away, they did this and that and this, and it's just horrible the things they had. They were lost, they should have been dead, but then by this incredible circumstance that obviously was divine, the Lord stepped in, rescued them, they gave their life to Christ, now they've been set free, they live for Him, and it is just a powerful testimony, a triumphant testimony, a wonderful testimony. We praise the Lord for it. Hallelujah! And then it's your turn. I just kind of grew up in church, went to church. Folks always made sure I was there. Yeah, I had a drug problem. They always drugged me to church. And so I'm involved and I do stuff. And, I became a Christian when I was like 10 or 12 or something, and yeah, that's my testimony. Okay, next. And we think it's not a very good testimony. Are you kidding me? That's one of the greatest testimonies. Because it has nothing to do with you. But a faithful father or mother or grandparent or an uncle or aunt or a neighbor who took the time to make sure that you were in the assembly. And you could hear the preaching and the singing and could see faithful people coming there to praise the Lord. It's a wonderful testimony. It's a testimony of what can be generational faithfulness. It's when we decide we're not going to be lazy with our faith, but we're going to make sure we get up every Sunday morning, whether we feel like it or not, and we're going to bring our family to observe the Lord's day. It's a testimony of not giving in to social pressures of the culture. of not enrolling our children in programs that will cause them to miss the Lord's Day, and the meeting around the table for the Lord's Supper, and violating Hebrews 10:25 of forsaking the assembly, which simply means, no, I wasn't that I was sick, or that means I could have been there, but I chose not to be. It's a testimony of where a mother, a father, aunt, uncle, grandparent, whoever, stands up and says, no more, that's enough. We're not going to let the culture dictate anymore what we're going to do with our family. It's a grandiose testimony because it can be anyone's testimony. Whether you grew up in that situation or you decide, I'm going to do that with my family now. Either way, it's a heroic testimony because it shows just how heroic simply being a godly father or mother or some other influential person in somebody's life. And that's the challenge from this lesson, is that if we grew up in it, will we continue that generational faithfulness? Or if we didn't, we're going to start it now. And we're just going to simply try the best we can to live faithfully in the moment each and every day and see what great things the Lord can do, because we're under attack. But we have a shield available to us that can extinguish the flaming arrows of the evil one. So let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. For he who promised is faithful. And to that we say, amen. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and look forward to the rest of our Lord's Day celebration, the victory we have in Christ. Yeah, so there you go.